Hey, good evening, everyone, at least in this part of the world. It's March 11th, 2021, and welcome to our March talk. This is the Orlando.NET user group, also known as OneTug, and we also are the same people who organized the Orlando Code Camp. And these are the people who currently run the organization. And you may see some of us on the calls. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. If you want to get familiar with OneTug, the best place to do so is meetup.com/OneTug. We are also pretty active on Twitter at the handle OneTug, and Facebook. Just search for OneTug, and we have a Twitch channel, although we haven't done that lately. On LinkedIn, just search for us. Upcoming meetings. So usually we try to hold one virtual coffee and one speaker a month. We don't have a speaker for the month of April yet. But if you know of anyone or if you're interested in speaking, just ping us with the topic. And if it matches our needs, we can definitely try to make a meetup out of that. Also, if you're interested in helping OneTug with monetary contributions, this is where you can do it. I just want to open the floor for community announcements. Anyone have any events coming up, any open source projects, or anything else related to community and technology? Feel free to come off mute and just speak. Or I should say, also, if you are listening to this meeting, just keep yourself on mute and you can hit the raise hand button if you have questions, and we will bring you off mute and you can ask questions. So tonight's agenda, basically, we have the welcome and the announcements. This talk is being recorded and will be on YouTube. So what I'll do is after this talk at some point, when we have the recording, I will upload it to YouTube and post the link on the meetup page so you can see it in the comments. And today's speaker is Facundo, and he is going to be speaking about how to master the terminal as a .NET developer. I know Facundo for a while now. Yeah, I also worked with him before this current job. He is a solutions architect at Boxport. He is also known as Mr. Cloud Native. Actually, I came up with that name myself, but it fits him. Started as a .NET dev, and since then he has gotten into the DevOps craze. Facundo's Twitter handle is GhanaCode, and that's his blog, ghanacode.com. And with that, I will hand it over to Facundo. Let me stop sharing.
Perfect.
Facundo, feel free to share. I will go on mute, and if there are questions, I'll interrupt you.
Okay. Any way that you can put the spotlight me? There we go. Does that work? Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
It says Spotlight video won't be recorded.
Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint though?
Yeah, I can see a PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Should I continue, Santosh?
Yes, please. Please continue.
Okay. All right. Welcome to this talk. I'm going to be talking about how to master the terminal as a .NET developer. As Santosh alluded, I'm currently helping companies adopt cloud-native applications on Azure. What that really means is helping them adopt Kubernetes and Docker. So there's a whole lot of terminal that I use daily. I'm currently a solutions architect at Boxboat, so that's what we do. And 100% just doing a whole lot of cloud native work, which is very much into open source tools and the adoption of Kubernetes and Docker, like I said. I've been doing DevOps for several years now in different flavors. So I used to do a whole lot of DevOps in the Microsoft realm, so a whole lot of Azure DevOps. But recently, as I joined Boxboat, I've been doing a whole lot more of the open source flavors, and especially the Kubernetes flavors of DevOps. So the impetus for this talk is essentially that as a .NET developer, I found it really hard to switch into the cloud native DevOps space. I couldn't find any guidance on the topic, right? So typically, it's much easier for somebody to adopt Kubernetes if they know the terminal, if they know Linux and Bash very well. So Kubernetes is just a much easier adoption for them. As a .NET developer, I found it a lot harder to do that, and I'll tell you why in a second. If you want to know more about different ways to adopt Kubernetes in Azure, I blog frequently at gaunacode.com. Like I said, I was a traditional .NET developer. I used a lot of Visual Studio, many different versions, started from 2012 all the way through 2019. That's when I kind of dropped off. And I loved ReSharper, right? I created a lot of IIS-based applications using .NET Framework and SQL Server. I also did some WinForms, WPF, and WCF work. C# is still my main object-oriented language, my main go-to programming language. I don't know Go or Python yet. As a .NET developer, though, I used to click some more, maybe do a little bit of typing, click some more, a little bit drag and drop, and maybe a little bit more typing, right? The Visual Studio was the place I used to spend most of my time in. SQL Server Management Studio as well, and both IDEs are really intense in terms of how powerful they are, how simple things can be when you spend your time in there, right?
Facundo, 1 second. I think your microphone is having trouble. Is it just me or are others also seeing the same?
Seems fine to me.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's fine.
It's fine. Okay. Thumbs up then. I'll continue. So in this new world of cloud native DevOps, I sometimes click, I do a whole lot of typing, type. I do a little bit of grunting when I mistype, then I type some more, and then I feel like I hacked into the matrix because of all the things going in front of my face. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. So why should this talk be important to you? If I were to imagine you already know C# and object-oriented really well, you already know some type of scripting language like JavaScript or TypeScript, and you probably use SQL a lot. So if you wanted to expand your skills and become a better developer, sometimes you're faced with questions like, should you adopt functional programming or should you learn a scripting language used for automation like Bash or PowerShell? And my take on it is that based on other people's opinions too, is that sometimes with functional programming, it's unlikely that you will actually use it practically. Whereas a scripting language like PowerShell or Bash, you are more likely to use it. I want to have a disclaimer that I'm not an expert in the terminal. I'm still learning. It is a huge topic. Also, if I make references to Kubernetes, Kubernetes is not a silver bullet, and opinions are my own. But if you came here to this talk with a different interest, like if you're interested in Kubernetes, that I want to make it very clear that you'll probably want to master Kubernetes, the terminal at some point, because Kubernetes is super influenced by Linux and the culture around Linux. Okay, so let me first start with the differences between a terminal and a shell. First, there's Bash, and Bash is a shell. It's essentially based on Unix, and you can issue commands, right? It is essentially an interface where you type the commands and it assumes that you already know what to do. Whereas a GUI, you can discover a lot of the actions that you want to do. Bash runs on Linux and Mac OS natively, and then you can run it on Windows through the Windows subsystem for Linux. PowerShell was a later answer from Microsoft towards Bash. It essentially is a task automation config management framework. So there's a lot of overlap between Bash and PowerShell because Microsoft wanted to make it easy to adopt, but at the same time, it's very opinionated, and in a typical Microsoft fashion, they try to make it really easy to use, where it's a single framework where you can go to and get all of the things that you need. Okay, so let me give you a quick demo of kind of like the differences here. Switch. So what I'm running here is the Windows terminal. It's a new program. Let me clear this. Okay. So this is a new program available on Windows 10. You can get it from the Microsoft Store. And the terminal itself is this outer layer where inside of it, you can launch different types of shells. So you can launch, for example, in this one, I have Windows Subsystem for Linux running Ubuntu 2004. So this is Z shell. And right here on the right, I have PowerShell. And I just wanted to point out the differences between the terminal. The terminal is this outer layer, the program itself, and the shell is the implementation, whether it's Bash or whether it's PowerShell or something else, right? Okay, any questions so far?
I always thought the other way around. The shell was the container and the terminal was the inside.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. I just wanted to make it clear because when you go to download the Windows terminal, they call it the terminal, right? So here's the page from the Microsoft store where essentially you download the Windows terminal and they make it clear that it's just a program where you can execute different shells. Because it took me a little while to get my head around that too as well. Okay. So we're gonna do a very quick Bash demo. I'm gonna show you essentially some of the basics. And let me pull up my notes here. Okay. The very first thing is ls. ls essentially just gives you all the files and folders underneath a given path. So right now I'm using Windows Subsystem for Linux. I'm in this folder path under repos, navigating file demos. And ls just gives you, again, the directories and the files. ls-la gives you the same information in a different format. So the -l is called a flag. The L is short for long. So this is showing you in long format. And the A is give me all the files. So you'll see that in the first result, there's no references to this dot and dot dot. So this is the dot is a current directory, the dot dot is the directory above. And what essentially the -la will do is it will list out all the files underneath the current directory, including hidden files. Okay. And all the scary Unix permissions in the front. There's also even more flags, like you can add an H, which means that it's human readable. And the output slightly different, but not too different. On the PowerShell side, you can also do ls. And you will notice that the information that I gave you is formatted completely different, right? What PowerShell instead, the difference between PowerShell and Bash, for example, is that PowerShell, everything it returns is an object by default. So what it actually returned back here is an object of type system.io directory information. Whereas here, this is just purely just text. Okay. Another thing about PowerShell is that there's a lot of things that are just aliases, so that you don't have to type in actual PowerShell commandlets. So for example, when I typed ls, what it actually is happening underneath the covers is that it's an alias for this PowerShell commandlet right here, get child item. So if I do get child item, you'll notice the same information, right? Now let me kind of show the difference a bit, and kind of where PowerShell starts to become a little bit different and a little bit more powerful than just traditional Bash. So there's one thing that you can do, for example, is manipulate all the objects coming out of the result. So let's say ls, and I'm going to iterate through each of the objects that came back in that return call, and just going to output the name. So get child item, or ls, right, gives us a list of objects, and you'll notice at the top here that there's properties. So there's a property for name, and when I did ls, or I could do the same thing with get child item, I piped it. So I grabbed those results of ls and I piped it into essentially a for each loop, where I have an expression that just selects the name out of that object. And so I'm just outputting the names of the folders underneath my current repository directory. Okay. Another difference between Bash and PowerShell is that, like I was saying, Microsoft makes it really easy for you to get what you need from just PowerShell and from a lot of the built-in commandlets. Whereas in Bash, you have to learn different little programs and how to stitch them together. So for example, there's a program called tree, and all it does is outputs the information or the file structure underneath that current directory. There's another program called JQ, what I might show later, which is essentially a way for you to parse JSON and select different fields out of it. Okay. Now let's talk through the navigation a bit. So navigating through folders through Bash is as simple as just cd to go into a given directory. So I'm going to go into this directory one subfolder, right? So then you can see my path change, and I'm underneath the nested directory one subfolder. I can go back out into the folder containing that by just doing a ... I can go to my home directory, which is a really important directory in Linux, and it's aliased with a squiggly line. So if I do that, you'll see that my path completely changed. And inside of Bash, there's built-in variables for a lot of things, one of them being the current directory, and this is short for that. So what this is saying right now is that my home directory is under this absolute path, home of Gauna. And if I want to navigate back to my navigating files demo underneath my repos directory, then I can do cd minus. And then you'll see that I'm back to that directory I was back at. Okay.
Facundo, question.
Yes.
So I noticed that you have all this fancy, colors and stuff. How did you do that on Windows Terminal?
I'll get to that in a later part. Does that work?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll give you some links at the end of the talk, essentially giving you a guide of how to have a very pretty PowerShell prompt. And also, I'll walk you through setting up the pretty Z shell within my Windows subsystem for Linux. If at the very least you can just show up and tell your coworkers about this amazing terminal you have, right? Another cool thing or kind of useful thing in Bash is running history. So if you just type history like I did right now, you'll see all the commands that I ran against this machine, right? You can also execute a history item by doing the bang and then the number of the history item. And you can see that it autofilled it for me right there. Now, what I keep doing over and over to kind of fold up the text because I'm doing a lot of commands is I'm running the clear command. And when I run clear, all it does is it clears my terminal so that my cursor's back at the top, right? A shortcut for this is Control L, and that's what I keep doing over and over. So if I type in, or if I hold Control L, then you'll see how everything just clears. And same thing with PowerShell. Okay, so main thing I wanted to get across here is that there's a lot of overlap between Bash and PowerShell. PowerShell, though, the main difference is that it deals a lot with objects where you can do advanced expressions, like as I showed you, you can do for each loops. And especially if you're used to link within .NET, a lot of the expressions available in PowerShell are going to become natural to you. Whereas in Bash, it's a bit more of a learning curve because you have to learn every little program that will become useful so that you can do something with the text that's being returned. Okay. So let me go back to the PowerPoint here. Oh, that's blank. That's weird. And back to the terminal. So one thing I do a lot of is when I use Bash, some of these programs that I use quite often is, for example, tmux. Tmux is essentially a way for you to use a single window, but have multiple sessions behind it. So it essentially multiplexes your windows so that you can have different sessions. And if I do tmux ls, you'll see that I have 3 sessions open. One of them I'm going to attach myself to. Now I'm attached inside of that tmux session, and you'll see that my folder path changed. I'm now underneath that dir1 directory, right? And this is because what I do with tmux is often run long-running commands that I don't necessarily want to sit there and watch. And it just becomes unproductive for me to keep creating sessions like this. Because I'll lose track of where I am. So it's much easier for me to do, for example, Terraform apply, where I create a bunch of infrastructure on the cloud, and it takes a long time. So I can go ahead and detach myself, go back to the main window, which I'm now at the main window. You can see that I attached myself earlier. And then I jump back into a different session. So I'll go into the second session here, and I can do Terraform plan. It executes for some time, and then maybe I do something else in a different session. Okay. Another cool aspect of tmux is that you can have sessions side by side. So this is a sessions that I opened earlier. It essentially SSH'd into some Raspberry Pis that I have here at home. SSH is like an RDP that is GUI-less, right? So SSH is a way for you to run terminal or bash commands against a server. And one of the cool features of tmux is that you can synchronize the windows so that if you're managing or if you're running a lot of repetitive commands, you can run them side by side or in parallel like this, right? So I just ran echo hello world and Raspberry Pi 1 and Raspberry Pi 2. Whereas if I try to do it with different session or different tabs like this, it would be, I think, impossible. I haven't tried it, but I think it would be really hard to do and a bit annoying to try and do copy and paste back and forth and run the same command across multiple windows. Okay. Let me attach myself back to the Pi. Right, so you can run more commands on the servers and stuff like that, and you can manage them side by side. All right, but in reality, I don't use a whole lot of WSL for my daily job because of I find it a little bit hard to do a lot of Linux work from WSL because of the gap between Windows and Linux. So what I sometimes do is I run a virtual machine using VMware, and inside of that, that's where I am completely 100% into Linux, and I do most of my work from this type of workstation. Later in this conversation and this presentation, I'm going to kind of outline some paths of when maybe you want to go down this approach and have a full dedicated VM versus when you just want to use the Windows terminal and WSL. Okay. I want to stop here. I want to hear from you if anybody has been trying to use the terminal a lot more lately, or learning PowerShell or Bash, and or maybe do a show of hands if anybody has been wanting to learn that or has been using it in their daily job regularly.
Yeah, I use PowerShell, the terminal quite a bit because, like you said, you can run a WSL session and a PowerShell session side by side, and it's very useful for have like a dedicated terminal for PowerShell, dedicated one for Python, and so on. So I just configured each one individually with different color schemes, so I know which window I'm on.
That's cool. Anybody else?
So these days I'm doing a lot of .NET development on Mac. So I'm doing a lot of PowerShell and ZSH. So that's fun.
Nice. Yeah, that's part of my setup, CSH. That's cool. Oh, do you use the .NET Core CLI a lot?
Yep. Yeah, that's kind of our main thing.
Very cool.
I'd like to be doing more in PowerShell though, less in ZSH if I could.
I personally prefer Bash, but PowerShell seems very powerful. Definitely, I haven't learned too much on the PowerShell side.
Yep, absolutely. Very cool. Thank you. All right. So this is how I essentially learned from myself many years ago. I did some really dumb things when I didn't know Bash and PowerShell, and I want to show you some of the use cases where this could have been a great fit. I had this use case as a .NET developer that I needed to trigger some maintenance tasks for our users so that we could trigger some workflows for them, because we didn't have a front end for this yet, right? So we had just an API call where we trigger some complicated business workflow, but we didn't have the UI fully defined yet. So what we needed to do was get some data from our own API, process it based on some criteria, filter, and then trigger a business workflow for our users in their behalf through the API, right? And the way that I did this at the time, because I didn't know Bash or PowerShell, was daisy chaining API calls together using Postman. So in Postman, there is this feature called tests. So as part of each Postman request, you can define JavaScript tests to grab the response back from a response and do some assertions. That's how you're supposed to do it. But one of the things you're also able to do is parse that JSON and set a Postman variable, and then combine with a different feature, which is Postman Runner, I believe. You can daisy chain Postman requests together. So essentially what I ended up doing was I would get some data, parse it, then set a variable using Postman, and then put it back on the API with that third request. And this turned out to be super problematic because Postman is not meant to be used this way. It's mostly those types of features are meant for API validation and testing, not doing some type of maintenance stats that I was trying to do. So it caused a lot of issues. And another dumb thing that I did when I also didn't know Bash or PowerShell is I needed to migrate data between APIs. So I'd have this origin API. I need to grab the JSON data, transform it, and put it back into a different API. I think I was migrating CRMs at that point. And I said, PowerShell is really dumb. It's really ugly. I know JavaScript. It's a scripting language, right? So I created a Node.js CLI tool where essentially I would grab some data with API, process it using a Node.js CLI app using commander.js, and then I will put it back in a different API. And the outcome of, or actually at the time, it felt like a good idea because I was parsing the data super easily compared to just having objects in C# or using dynamics. And I could write unit tests theoretically using JavaScript as well. And I told myself that it was a good idea because .NET Core CLI tools wasn't a thing back then, and CLI is the future. What the result of this was that it worked, but it turned out to be a kind of a little complicated program. It took me 3 to 4 days, and I ended up throwing it away, right? I never used it again. When in reality, if I knew Bash or PowerShell, I probably could have done it in a matter of hours and not days, and not try to reinvent the wheel here. So let me give you kind of a quick demo here of how you can interact with an API using PowerShell. And let me pull up Teams. All right. So there is this sample API called REST API example, and it gives you some JSON back. In PowerShell, you can issue an API call with just invoke web request, right? So I have, if you see the bottom here, I have a terminal open, and I can issue an API call against that REST API. And you'll see that we get an object back with a property called status code, status description, content, raw content. Is essentially an HTTP response object in C#, right? Then what we can do is we can grab the content that's in here, and you can see that is familiar JSON through this commandlet called select object expand property. Yeah, select object expand property content. Let me close this here. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to pipe the result from this API request into that select object, which is essentially just drilling down into that property and just giving us the result from the content. And now you can see that we're just getting JSON back. At this point, this is just a string. So what we can do next is actually convert it into an object. So we're going to be translating this string into JSON, or from JSON into an object. And now we converted it, and you can see that we have an object called, well, it doesn't have a name, but it has a property called status and data. Inside of status, it says success. Underneath data, we have more nested objects. So long story short, now we have an API request where selecting the content, the JSON. We're converting that JSON string into an object. And then we're going to iterate through each of those objects and then select the property ID and then the employee name. So I'm going to grab this part. And they're going to iterate through each of those pieces. And now you'll see that essentially we have a new object, list of objects with the properties ID and employee name, right? So you can see all the IDs going down and all the employee names. And we can take it one step further and convert it to a CSV file. So now we went from API request to JSON string to JSON object to a projection of little objects that are now converted into CSV files or in CSV format. And the last thing is that you can pipe that result into a file. So if I run everything together, we should have, right, all this data being fed into objects. Let me go right here. There we go. You see these objects that we're creating essentially projections, and then everything is going to be outputted into a CSV file. So now PowerShell people, oops, wrong command. So if I read that file, which is this command called cat, concatenate, if I read that file, you see that we have a CSV file, and it wasn't too hard. All right. Any questions there?
Seems simple.
Okay, cool. Very good. All right. So what I want to present to you is two different paths to essentially mastering the terminal. There's a slow path, which I kind of accidentally went down. And this means learning PowerShell, because you'll be a lot more productive, especially since you already know .NET. And it works really well in Windows. Once you master and you learn PowerShell, and not only that, but you use it on your daily job as much as possible to get some experience with it, then you can start learning Bash, and making the jump from this shell to that shell should be a lot smoother. Here's some of the ways I used PowerShell in the real world. One time, Santosh and I worked for the company where they had a lot of app-specific configuration files stored in the file system. There was a lot of JSON, and it was used as configuration as opposed to storing that configuration in some type of database, right? So we had to manipulate a whole lot of JSON in files without causing mistakes. So we wrote PowerShell scripts essentially to turn toggles on and off against these files. And in that way, helped with the deployment of these intricate apps. And one thing that's really cool about PowerShell is that you can write unit tests and you can do mocks. So you can mock out commandlets without actually changing files, so that you have greater confidence of what you're doing before you actually run it and you break things, right? I find that to be a huge safety net. One of my favorite things about PowerShell is the ability to write unit tests, because in the Bash world, I'm pretty sure you can't do that. And what people end up doing is when they have Bash that grows out of hand and Bash scripts that go out of hand, they end up converting them to Python or Go or something else so that they can be more maintainable. Another cool use case for PowerShell is generating code snippets. This can be really cool and creative. For example, one time somebody taught me that you can use an Excel spreadsheet to essentially grab a CSV file and then have a dynamic column at the far right that you would concatenate a bunch of strings together to generate SQL statements. And that can be quite messy. I think it's much simpler to do with something like PowerShell, where you iterate through a CSV file, as I was showing you in a way. And then you build these strings that you're later going to be able to copy and paste into SQL Server Management Studio, or even output them into a file, right? So it can be really powerful that way. Another use case I just did a few days ago was scaffolding new projects. So especially in this realm of microservices or immutable infrastructure, where you have infrastructure written as code and in modules, there's probably a lot more code and a lot more repositories that you have to set up. So it can be quite productive to set up a Bash or PowerShell script to essentially scaffold a new repository with the file layout that you want, with all the projects that you want, and etc. And even do some basic Git configuration on a new repo. You can also automate the provisioning of cloud infrastructure. Obviously, you have the Azure CLI, the AWS CLI, the Google Cloud CLI. Those are really powerful CLIs. You can use those CLIs with PowerShell. So that can be a good way. Or you can use, if you're in Azure, you can use the Azure RM module to interact with Azure through PowerShell natively. But long story short, what can be really cool about this is environment promotion process where you don't use infrastructure as code, right? So I remember one project with CentOS, essentially, we weren't allowed to touch production or even the environments before it. So the way that we would get infrastructure provisioned and delivered to them was essentially create scripts that we can hand off to their operations guys and they can run it themselves. If you're a little bit more mature, you can also create one-time scripts that do one-time configuration, like seeding data into some type of secret vault, a key vault or some kind, and that can be like one-off scripts that you run, or hand them off to some type of admin so that they can run them. And lastly, the way that you run unit tests with PowerShell is with a framework called Pester. And with the same framework, you can essentially retrofit it to make it run end-to-end tests. So as I was showing you, it's really easy to do API calls against an API, right? So inside of each of these unit test methods, just like when you use XUnit, and you can make XUnit run integration tests as opposed to unit tests, you can make Pester run end-to-end tests as opposed to unit tests. And so you can have a framework that is not Postman. It's just PowerShell tests that run as part of your CI/CD pipeline against the API that's deployed somewhere, and the pipeline will fail if some of those tests fail. I really like that use case. So essentially, you can have a pipeline that spins up all the microservices containers that you have using Docker Compose, and then you trigger pestered end-to-end tests against your ephemeral environment, and then your pipeline will fail if some of those end-to-end tests fail, and it will report the test results because Tester supports different unit testing reporting mechanisms like the NUnit format and other types of formats as well. So food for thought. I mean, PowerShell is definitely one of those skills that might be a little bit more useful than just learning a functional programming language. And it can be just another tool that you add to your tool belt and you use from time to time for these ad hoc tasks that you might have. And if you want to head into the fast lane, into this fast path of learning how to master the terminal as quickly as possible, then I have a more controversial approach, which is kind of what I'm using today. And this means that you would be running some type of Linux virtual machine on your Windows laptop or your Mac OS computer. And on top of Ubuntu, you would replace the Windows Manager with something like i3. And then you can install Z Shell, OMIC Shell, and Power Level 10K, which I'll talk about in a minute here. Okay, so as I was showing you here, let me go back to my virtual machine. And let me show you this drastic setup that I have in order to force myself to learn this new culture of Linux and Unix. So inside of my virtual machine, you can see that I'm running Ubuntu. And you don't see the Ubuntu desktop. Let me log out again. You don't see the Ubuntu desktop because instead I'm using i3 as a Windows manager. So I'm going to prove to you here that it's Ubuntu. You can see that this is my workstation. It is definitely an Ubuntu desktop machine. So let me log out again and go back into i3. So it essentially, imagine if you can change the look and feel of Windows, right? This is what I'm doing with i3. It's just replacing the top level interface of Ubuntu with i3, where it's extremely keyboard heavy. So this is it. I'm in. There's a lot of staring into the void of space, right? When I do Windows Enter, I get a new terminal. And then purely through the keyboard, I can create new terminals. And purely through the keyboard, I have to launch applications like Code or Chrome. And everything is based on essentially Linux, right? So this is my web browser. I'm going to move it over here to my second desktop. So at the bottom left, you'll see the number 1 and the number 2. So these are very similar to the Windows 10 desktops. So on my number 1, I have these 2 terminals, then I have Code. And then on my number 2 desktop, I have Chrome. And what this did for me is essentially every time I have to install anything, I have to figure out how to install it on Linux. It forces me to use the command line a lot, create aliases, and set up my environment in a way that's really friendly with Cloud Native and Kubernetes and Docker. Okay. All right, go back to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so closing up here, I'm gonna walk you through some of the resources, and I'll definitely drop the links in the chat. So the first one I already kind of talked about, right? Downloading the Windows terminal, really useful. Definitely part of the kind of the slow path if you want to use PowerShell, right? This is a guide from Microsoft on how you can set up a very pretty Windows terminal for PowerShell. So these set of instructions are for PowerShell. And then they also walk you through installing Powerline on Ubuntu and WSL. The first part is what I was showing you on my personal setup. The second part is not what I'm using, right? What I'm using instead on my WSL terminal or setup is essentially Z shell, which is an improvement over Bash. It has a lot more capabilities, like a better plugin system, some better autocomplete features. And with Z shell, it can be the foundation for a tool called Oh My Z Shell, where it essentially gives you a very rich configuration and extension system, a plugin system on top of your Z shell, so that, I know it's a bit of yak shaving here and we're building up to the grand moment, so that you can install a theme like Power Level 10K. So that's what I'm running personally. I installed Z shell, Oh My Z shell, and Power Level 10K to have that look and feel with the pretty icons. So you can see I have more of this setup down here where I have the current operating system, the folders, the Git branches, and a lot of information. And one of the easiest ways to install Power Level 10K is through Oh My Z shell. Okay, so I'll drop those in the chat. Any questions? And this should answer your question, Santosh. Let me know if it doesn't.
No, it does. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. Now questions. I'll go ahead and drop this in the chat.
So, question for you. Obviously, you do quite a bit of work with Azure, and you use code. And what is your preferred? Do you use PowerShell more, or do you use CLI, or which one do you generally prefer to?
When I deal with Azure, I use Azure CLI a lot. I find that to be a bit easier to use. If I don't have what I need, I'll jump into Azure RM, which is the module for PowerShell, right? But you can use PowerShell and the Azure CLI together, so that's usually not a problem for me. Yeah.
And CLI, do you run that from Bash, I guess?
Yeah, either or. As you know, being a consultant, it's kind of tricky because sometimes we're giving customer laptops. So it really depends on the scenario, right?
Right.
I don't have a fully 100% fluid setup because of that, because I have to essentially reset up my machine per client in many cases. So that's unfortunate for me, though.
You should have a bunch of PowerShell scripts that do that.
Yeah. No, a lot of my coworkers actually have repositories. They're called the dot files repository, where essentially you can have all the configuration that you have for Z shell and other types of customizations committed to a repository. So it's easy for you to kind of reset it up, right?
Do you have the resources for that, or can you share that later?
Yeah, I'll share that later.
Okay, thanks.
I know Jessica Dean has one. And if some of my coworkers have it too, I'll probably do that as well. So this is what a dot files repository looks like. One day I'll get here, but essentially it's a script that you run once and it'll configure your entire dev environment, right?
Sweet.
For me though, installing Power Level 10K is not too hard because I've done it several times now. So I haven't found the need to create one yet, but maybe in the future I will.
So do you usually follow the sequence you showed us, or do you do it in a different sequence? What's your preferred approach?
What sequence are you talking about?
Like the sequence in which you showed us the different ways to set up our environments and make them look prettier.
Yeah, I mean, so I use WSL for my side projects essentially. So as I was showing you, my Windows terminal stuff is for my side projects, and that's how I manipulate all my side stuff. Then for my work stuff, I have that Linux virtual machine where I have it configured with Z Shell as well and power level and 10K. I have a lot of aliases there too. Aliases are essentially shortcuts where I don't have to type commands that I run often, right? So I do that a lot as well. And Sentosh, you said you just use Windows Terminal, right?
Yeah. My use is more basic, but I basically went in and changed the JSON settings and the skins and stuff. So the color scheme looks different on each one, and each one has like different startup environments. So one is for Python, one is for plain Windows. And if I also added like what's that? Oh my posh, I think.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
like my Z Shell. Yep.
Yeah, so that one kind of makes it like, if you switch into a folder that has Git, it'll automatically show like, how many commits do you have and stuff like that. It reflects that in the command prompt. So
Right. Yeah, my setup does too. Right. So if like I'm showing you right now is exactly is a well, it's not quite a repo yet. So let me go into a real repo here. Let me go into my blog. And you'll see the branch and that it comes from GitHub. You'll see the Octocat there. So that's kind of cute. If you use Bitbucket, this will show with Bitbucket. So that's cute as well. Power level 10K is also kind of cool because if you use Kubernetes, it'll also tell you the context that you're using. So right now it's showing me that I'm using commands against my Raspberry Pi. When I use Azure, it'll show me what Azure description I'm making commands against too. So that's really cool as well. I find that useful because I can just go up and see against which Kubernetes cluster I ran commands against, which Azure subscription I ran commands against. There's one more thing I'm forgetting about. But... Okay, I'm also going to put in the chat the PowerShell course that I used several years ago to learn PowerShell. I think you don't have to watch the entire thing, but pieces of it could save you a whole lot of time in learning PowerShell. So let me walk you through that agenda. So if you want to learn a little bit about PowerShell, you have a foot up because you already know .NET and PowerShell is so integrated with .NET. You can probably skip a lot of these sections. So you probably can skip out the last two sections here. You can probably skip out on this Mercurial, but at least the very basics of how to use PowerShell, they're covered here, and it's a pretty quick course. So you can see that this two sections here, it's probably puts you at about an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you fast forward, or if you watch the first section here too as well. So it doesn't have to be a huge investment, and you can get started kind of slowly and start thinking about how to use the terminal more often. All right. If anybody doesn't have any other questions, I guess we can kind of start closing out here.
Yeah, so anyone else have questions?
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I guess my question is just: is there a point where you might decide, okay, what I'm trying to do with PowerShell be better as like a .NET tool or something that then gets run from another set of PowerShell scripts? Is there any kind of guideline for that?
Yeah, I find myself that kind of the runway, that's the word. Sorry, it's a little late. The runway for PowerShell, it's a lot longer than Bash. So with Bash, maybe if you start scrolling a whole lot because your script starts to get a whole lot longer, then you want to kind of translate that into something more maintainable like Python, right? And especially since you can't write unit tests or do mocks. With PowerShell, because you can write unit tests and mocks and commandlets and create modules, it becomes a lot more maintainable. So what I've done in the past is actually prototype integrations between APIs, right? Something that's going to ultimately end up in code. I prototype MVP with PowerShell. And once I discover and I iterate through all those APIs and how they work, then I'll come back and I'll rewrite it as actual code and maybe fold it into the application. But it can be a really powerful like experimentation tool.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I heard that you can customize the terminal by using dot files in it. You try using that?
Yeah. I haven't yet. I know a lot of people, and I work with a lot of people that do. But yeah, in the link here in the chat, I put a link to someone's .files repository. Essentially, it's like you're saying, it's a way for you to recreate your development environment across multiple computers by just running a script and having all your configuration and Git repository. So that's cool. Maybe I'll grow into that one day, but I haven't found the need yet. Anybody here using .files or have a .files repository?
No, it looks interesting though. I think I'll give it a check.
I don't really know what a dot file is.
So a .file, let's talk about that. I think it's so in Z Shell and in Bash and Powerful, I didn't cover this, but there's something called a profile. So in Z Shell, right, and same thing as Bash. You have a built-in script that typically starts with a dot, and that's referred to as dot file, because these are kind of built-in scripts that always get run before you launch a session. So in Z Shell, right, I have this built-in Z Shell RC, where essentially it's just a big old Bash script that gets run each time. And same thing with PowerShell. You have a PowerShell profile, and it has PowerShell commandlets that get run on each PowerShell session.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. But for PowerShell, it doesn't start with a dot though, so that's why it's maybe a little bit more rare. So you can see that the location for my profile is under Documents, PowerShell, Microsoft PowerShell Profile PS1. And so definitely the .files repository is more tailored to the Bash Z Shell kind of setup where all the configuration starts with a dot.
Right, gotcha.
But it's actually an old concept. Because I mean, in another life, I was a Unix Linux Emacs programmer.
Yeah.
And it's all the way back from those days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
.Emacs, and being able to copy that, because that was like scripts and everything else in there. So I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what is all this new again, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I don't have anything more to share. Thank you so much for paying attention, staying awake. I know it's late. And it was a pleasure just giving this talk. If you have any feedback for me, I try to make it as simple as possible. I know when I was learning this topic, it was a lot to take in at once. So if you have any feedback.
I was thinking that it would be one thing you could add to this is you could give some examples of the pester unit testing, because I think that's really powerful. Like when people see unit testing in PowerShell, I think that kind of Now, a lot of people don't realize that can be done, so it makes it a really, that's
Yeah,
something.
maybe it can be a future talk. I can just give a talk about how to write end-to-end tests with Pester, because that can be a huge topic in its own. But anyway.
All right.
All right.